What's going on, guys? I'm Chris, and this is Regular Guy Training. So, you guys have absolutely been beating me to death over yet another Tupperware gun that's come out, and you guys want this one. You guys want the freaking the P10 from CZ and the M&P 2.0 compact. I get it. So I'm handling one, and I'll work on getting the other two done. So, contrary to popular belief, okay, I'm not a giant fan of the Tupperware guns and stuff. If we're talking about stuff that I quote like, I've always been a 1911 guy. I love good, well-built 1911s, and steel guns just do it for me. However, I recognize the merit of the Tupperware guns. I recognize their simplicity, and I recognize how reliable and bomb-proof that they are. So that's the reason why I carry them as far as concealed most of the time, okay? So, the Gen 5 Glock. There's been a lot of little reviews coming out here and there and stuff. I recently got mine. It was actually a Christmas present from my wife because she's fucking awesome. And I decided I was going to send a bunch of rounds through this guy, including like demos and classes I've taught, and just regular practice and shooting and all that other stuff after I gotten my hands on a Gen 5 Glock 17, which I'll also be providing a review on. And before I made any like heavier alterations, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to stipple this guy, I wanted to go ahead and push out this initial review before I continue to beat the absolute crap out of this thing. So, here we go. Let's go ahead and go through a bunch of changes that were made to the gun. Some things that I view as positive things, some things that I view as questionable or negative things, whichever. You guys know how it is at this point. First and foremost, there are some people complaining about the fit that this gun has to like certain holsters and stuff, and I understand that there's a issue here and there. But, with most concealed holsters that I've thrown this guy into, this works really well. This is a Smoky Mountain concealment holster, as well as one of their little mag carriers, and it fits in there just fine. The only thing that you'll notice is that the difference between it and a regular Gen 4 is that it pushes out ever so slightly from the very inside. I notice that doesn't wear any different because this portion of the holster pushes against the body. No big deal. And the reason why it's pushing out is because of the ambidextrous slide stop, which does stick out just a little bit farther than its Gen 4 counterpart. But, aside of a little bit of holster compatibility issues with certain folks out there, I'm pretty sure that whoever you've got as a holster manufacturer will help you remedy that situation. Now, here it is. We're going to talk about the external stuff first before we rip this guy apart, and we will do a real detailed rip apart of this gun because there's a lot of little changes that were done to the Glock, and you'll get my summarized thoughts on that at the end. First and foremost, we're going to talk about sights. There are a lot more metal sights that are available. For instance, the Magwell offers a night sight alternative that sells on average about $30 more than the quote-unquote basic bitch Glocks that come with the regular plastic sights. And, honestly, it's not bad for an extra $30 to spend on a pistol right at the gate, because these are Magwell sights and they were like $48 separate from the gun. So there you go. The only thing is that like most of the sight options that come with Glocks, like that get thrown in the gun shops and stuff like that, are 3-dot setup, and I'm not a personal fan, so I decided to get a basic bitch Glock with regular plastic sights that I can just throw these sights onto. I should have gotten pictures of this and compared this to previous generation plastic sights, but I didn't. You'll have to forgive me. But the Gen 5 plastic sights that come with the gun are actually more preferable to me as like a placeholder or something that you can just take out and shoot before your sights show up. The notch in the rear was widened a little bit, which helps out with target obscurity and stuff like that. And they're more boxy rather than flaring out to take up the whole rear sight notch. which is good to me personally because they're a little more angular. It's a little bit easier to get a good clean lineup with the front sight if I'm taking a precise shot. And it's a little bit easier to run the slide off of like a holster and stuff like that. Even though I don't really recommend that, you'll probably rip them off after a certain number of reps. So, there it is. They still kept the boxy, the white box with a golf ball up front, which I'm not a huge fan of. And while my standard Glock sights were holding place for these, I just blacked those guys out and, called it good until I got my replacements. The next thing up here is the cut on the slide, okay? The cut on the slide, it was advertised as something that's easier to slip in and out of a holster and stuff like that. That's kind of dumb. That was a really crappy selling point because I've never had problems holstering up a gun. And as far as just like aesthetics, to me, it makes a blocky, ugly gun even uglier because it's like an attempt to like streamline it without doing anything else, right? So to me, it makes it look worse, but that's all aesthetics. It doesn't really do anything negative to me. Here's something though that a lot of people complain about. There's a tiny little difference between frame cut and slide cut. Like there's people complaining about how they didn't match up one with the other, meaning slide to the frame respectively. And in all honesty, in like the tiny amount of frame that isn't cut off, like that you can barely hook a freaking fingernail onto, I'm gonna be real with you. I understand for like aesthetics and stuff like that, but if people are pulling this out as a legitimate criticism of the new gen Glocks, I think your priorities are a little dicked up, my opinion. So there's that. Now, more on the outside changes. The something that surprises me that a lot of guys don't cover is that the dust cover rail that you can attach lights to was changed to a 1913 rail rather than a Glock rail, which I think is awesome because for those of you that switch like your TLR ones and your Surefires and stuff like that back and forth between like it on your pistol to a rifle or something like that, like board gun guys do, you don't have to change out those little inserts anymore, and you don't have to worry about like fitment issues on 1913 rails, like rattling back and forth and stuff like that, because it's a 1913 rail that's on the dust cover of the Gen 5 Glock. Finally, one of my chief complaints of the older designs was addressed, which is great. It just makes things a little bit easier when swapping stuff out from one thing to another. And you guys know that I swap gear from one to the other a lot. So, for me individually, it works out great. And for guys that switch pistol lights to rifles and stuff like that, you'll find that kind of a neat addition as well, seeing as most pistol dust covers have 1913 sections rather than the Glock rail, which is awesome. The next thing, I previously brought this up, and that would be the slide stop lever. It's now ambidextrous. It hangs out a little bit more. There's some criticism saying that, it's still puny, man. And you know what? I agree that, yeah, it's small, but because it sticks out a little bit more than a Gen 4's, you know what? It actually works much better. Because when you get ready to go do a reload, this little portion, this tiny little corner that sticks out just a little bit more, right, on the reload itself, this tiny portion of the slide lock lever that sticks out just a little bit more does indeed help. Because it does take a little bit of effort to push this guy down, and when you're inserting a magazine and stuff, you can essentially park that digit right on that little corner. It's a great little reference point, and right when that magazine seats, it's pretty easy to manage your leverage and throw it in that slide lock lever. And obviously it's just as easy to do on the other side, and because it sits out just a little bit farther, it does help quite a bit in using that slide stop lever. I don't plan on changing this out for a larger one because it's out of the way enough, but in the way enough to make it work. Now, I will say that because I've shot right-handed only Glocks for years, obviously, because until now there haven't been ambi slide stop levers on them. I've had a couple of issues getting the gun to go in a slide lock on the last shot fired. And that's only because my grip, it's just institutionalized at this point. Like my previous grip with Gen 4 Glocks was to just dive in there real deep and settle on the frame, using it as essentially a little parking space for my hands to line up. And with the new slide stops out there, I have a tendency, still not as often as I used to, but I still have a little bit of a tendency to not allow the slide stop to work. And I think you guys see that a couple of times in the shoot footage, which I'm working away from. You know, all I really have to do is just hook this thumb over so I'm not pressing on it while under recoil and stuff. And, you know, it's more learned behavior on that part. So it works out for me. Every once in a while I do have to do a quick tap rack because, you know, that's how it is. And then I end up finding out, okay, the gun's empty, and go from there. Not a big deal. Moving on, the finish was changed. And why the finish was changed, I don't know. You notice that it is, in fact, a little bit more slick. To be honest with you, it's not that big of a deal. There are some guys that use that as a complaint tool where they're like, oh, well, it's so slippery now. It's really not. Okay, it's really not. If you're running the slide and stuff, you're not going to slip off in regular daylight with dry hands and all that stuff. You know, and even on the previous gen Glocks, if it's been raining a whole lot, because that's never happened in my classes, I've slipped off of Gen 4 slides too. So if anything, because I have in my mind that this is a more slick slide, I'm more careful with it, and I just run it like normal. I understand if guys have little issues with it here and there, but ultimately it's not that big of a deal to me because it's real easy to just get on the thing and run it like normal. Even in the awkward, like over the top of the camera angle I had to do to lock this guy to the rear, it's no big deal. But why it was changed is more of a mystery to me, and we'll get back to that in a bit here. Now, I understand that with some of the later Gen 4 guns, Glock essentially wanted to take that little aftermarket part out of business by offering backstraps to interchange a little bit, and they provide a slightly longer pin to where you can get yourself a little beaver tail on here if you want, or not, depending on your preference. I chose the slightly larger one, mostly to back my thumb off from this slide lock lever here. And the only real reason why I did that is because right now I have a tendency to not allow it to go into slide lock every time. It's sometimes like 1 in 10 now. But I do like beaver tails and stuff, and as far as concealed carry and stuff like that is concerned, it's not an issue to me. However, those of you that do find that an issue, that's great because you can just throw like a standard one on there. Moving on to the frame, the Glock quote-unquote hump is still there, which I like to refer to as the Browning high power hump because that's where we first begin to see that kind of stuff. It's still there. It's not a big deal. And in all honesty, to me, it helps me keep the gun flatter when I'm trying to shoot it fast because there's a little bit of leverage that I can work with to keep the gun stable while I'm shooting it at an accelerated pace. It's not a big deal. I've shot enough plastic guns as well as, regular grip angled guns like 1911s and stuff like that to where it doesn't matter to me. Just pick up the pistol and, side alignment, side picture, trigger press. Do your job right and you're fine. I do understand that there are some people that have a little bit of an issue and have to train out of the fact that Glocks tend to naturally point a little bit higher, particularly under speed. I get that. If that's an issue with you, that's an issue with you. And you know what? I side with those guys and saying, Glock could have provided a straight backstrap, especially with all this friggin' room that's back here. Okay? So, okay. I get it and I understand. It just doesn't bother me personally. Now, moving on to the trigger here. I did notice that the trigger itself is a little bit better. It's still a little creepy. You still have to deal with a double action pull in the thing because by all intents and purposes, striker fired guns are still double action pistols. I have a video about that. But not the point. Point is that it's still pretty reminiscent to earlier Glocks to where you have a bunch of space, stacked weight, press all the way through for a 1/4 inch, reset at a 1/4 inch. Not a big deal. Stock Glock triggers are not that bad, but I understand there's a lot of people that think they suck, which, being real here, this is slightly less suck. There's slightly less grit in there, which, okay, cool, that works. And now on the thing that a lot of people were talking about, there's no finger grooves here. Look, I get it for those of you that do have a gripe with finger grooves and stuff. I understand, but I don't care. One way or another, I just picked it up, and I didn't even really notice until it was pointed out to me that the finger grooves weren't there. It was one of those things where, like, after the 3rd magazine, my buddy Todd out at Red River Tactical is just kind of like, hey, they took out the finger grooves. I'm like, oh shit, I'll be damned. And that's when I was shooting his Gen 5 17, which I'll be doing a review on also. So not a big deal. Now, here's a point of contention between some people, because there is a cut up front here that's similar to a Gen 2 cut, only a little bit higher than before. I'll be real with you, it matters not to me at all. Like, you guys like get the deal here. I'm very much a club swinger. I don't sit there and worry about all of the little tiny details that could affect major things here and there. To me, it's a non-issue. The cut there doesn't really bother me all that much. There are some people that worry about, like their grip and getting pinched and feeling the corner of this and stuff like that. Honestly, every single person I handed this to in a class or otherwise didn't feel it at all. Some of them I had to point out this cut to after the fact. And for those of you that are complaining about the, quote, sharpness on the frame, dude, like, I don't see why this is that big of a problem, minus the tiniest of inconveniences on your part. I mean, on the Glock 17, it's slightly more extended, so it pushes it farther away. And unless you have gigantic fingers, which I do have thin but long fingers, that's the only point that you'll notice. There's also guys that are worried about pinching, and I was after I shot the 17. Okay? And nope. And everyone else I've handed this gun to hasn't had an issue with pinching at all, so not a big deal. The new Glock magazines have a slightly extended base plate on them, which the idea is to help you get in here and strip the magazine out under Type 3 stoppages and stuff like that, which works out pretty good. I mean, you can also use the base plate there to hook this on a pocket or a belt or something and yoke that guy out. If you're on one-handed stuff, okay, cool, that works. Again, 100% indifferent. The only thing that I notice really about this guy is that there's an orange follower in it. You can actually see it there. There's an orange follower in it, which, it seems that that Glock had taken a page directly out of Magwell and CZ, their little playbook there, and used that, which is fine. What I did notice, though, is that loading magazines by hand on the Gen 5 mags is actually a little bit easier. I don't really know why. It might have something to do with like spring tensioning or follower length or whatever, but I did notice that they're a little bit easier to load. Minor convenience that actually helps out, and I don't see any reliability issues if it's a lightened up spring. I don't see any issues in reliability with that. Granted, this gun is 3,000 rounds old, so I don't know. I don't know if it'll pop up later. Quick little side note, this is made by Minuteman Munitions. My buddy Jake brought this out to the last class that I taught in Indiana. It's a polymer jacketed bullet. They run really good, and they're supposedly really, really cheap. They run like 14 cents a round, so go find them, buy them, because they run well. We even ran the stuff out of an MP5, and if your stuff can run out of a submachine gun, it'll run on anything else. But back to this. There are some internal changes that were made to the Gen 5 Glocks. There's actually a bunch of them, really. But I will go ahead and get into them. But before I'm going to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and pause this real quick, rip this gun all the way apart, and then we'll talk about it. Really quickly, though, before we get into that, I'm going to talk about this real quick, the flared Magwell. It's so not noticed by me that I had almost completely forgotten to talk about it in the first place. Does it help? I have no freaking idea because I never had issues loading the Gen 4 guns. But for those of you that that are like in the summertime and stuff, you'll notice that this ledges out a little bit. No, that's not a camera issue. No, this does flare out just a little bit more in the frame, and that could affect concealed carry stuff. It doesn't for me personally, but it could affect others that carry appendix or in any other style and have the gun running kind of tight to them, like especially with like their shirt and stuff that have like the beginnings of a print going on. This is not going to help that. So, whatever. Let's go ahead and strip the gun now. Okay, so let's get into this. The locking block looks about the same as it did normally. The slide lock lever is actually really neat, and I like this, right? And here's why I like this. The reason why I dig this, and I'll wait until this camera focuses, right, is that it is a one-piece unit that also has a pretty good little return spring. This is a coiled spring that helps force it into position and keep the whole thing contained as a unit. Quite unlike a lot of ambi slide stops, and I know this is a lefty problem, but if you shoot bipolar side or two-handed but on the other side, you may or may not have noticed that on guns like the M&P 2.0, for instance, that this lever is freaking useless, especially on a new gun. You'll see this portion of the bar just flexing and bending and not really doing anything, right? The lever itself is very thick, and it's helped be supported by this individual spring here, which helps it return into place, and it helps the user use it properly, which is excellent. But a problem that you're going to find out really, really fast is that while a ghost connector or something will work with this trigger, aftermarket triggers like something from Zev will not, because this trigger bar is designed very slightly different from the Gen 4s and 3s and stuff like that, because the trigger spring that's in here is now contained within the unit rather than hooked up here and all that. So aftermarket trigger companies are going to have to essentially redesign their stuff to fit these guns a little bit better, or to actually fit these guns, hook up with the components properly and work. Now, let's get on this finish really quick, because I don't know, I didn't notice really how it's better, really. I mean, if you change the finish, it's supposedly so that the finish is better, but after a few thousand rounds, I'm noticing, well, it's wearing about the same or worse than a Gen 4, right? So I don't really know why the finish on the barrel was, on the slide and stuff was changed that way. And obviously you see that the wear pattern on the barrel is about the same, right? Now there's other stuff that Glock is pushing out. Like they have a quote-unquote marksman barrel that has regular rifling and stuff in it. And man, I hate shit like that. I really do hate it when people push out sales tactics like XDMs, which don't work very well anyway, pushing out the fact that there's a quote match barrel in there, because guns that don't advertise that, the dudes that shoot amazingly well with an M9 style pistol or a 226 and stuff like that, they don't have a match or a marksman barrel, so that makes them worse. No, in all honesty, unless someone is paid to shoot, I've never seen anyone outshoot their pistol barrel. I'm sorry. So I don't know. It's kind of annoying to hear that stuff over and over. But moving on to this, you'll notice that if you compare this to the Gen 4 or 3 gun that you have, right, this firing pin block is slightly more rounded, which does help as far as just your individual trigger pull and stuff like that. It makes things a little bit smoother. Not a whole lot, though. It's not a big deal in any real way. And apparently, the striker was designed very slightly different. So that's yet another thing that's Gen 5 exclusive, which I understand, Differences between the generations vary a little bit. This one varies the most. And for those of you that have a bajillion Glocks already, like I do, you could find this a problem as far as changing out parts and all that stuff is concerned. But, realistically speaking, what does all this mean? We'll go ahead and put this gun back together and we'll have some final thoughts. Oh, and before I have this guy completely together, a couple of things that I failed to mention. First thing, which some of you may like or not like, I personally like it, the serrations on the trigger are gone, which to me it was always just a very minor annoyance thing. Like if I was out shooting my Gen 4 a lot, I would start to feel it in the pad of my finger. No real big deal, but it is a little itty bitty nicety to have there. And the leaf spring that used to secure, your takedown lever and stuff, there was a little leaf spring that you would see protruding out here. It's a coil spring now that you can actually see right there. That guy right there. Right there. It's a coil spring now, which is great because it's less prone to failure. And before your eyes glaze over and you're like, whatever. I have seen those springs break before and takedown levers just fall out of guns. Okay. It only happened on a couple of occasions, and one actually happened on my Gen 4. Okay. And all that really meant was to replace that individual spring, but because it's a coil spring now, I actually think that's much better. I think it's a more robust design for that individual takedown lever, and you can actually tell it's a little more stiffer because when you get ready to take apart the gun, it's actually a little bit more difficult to pull it apart, which to me is a positive thing. So, there it is. Also, whether or not that you notice this, you may actually, if you hold one up side by side with the other. This is supposedly for greater reliability and stuff like that, but you'll see that the slide is separated a little bit more from the frame. It rides a little bit higher. Does it change recoil impulse? No, and I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it act unreliably in any way yet. But apparently, all the little stuff that they did to these guns, while also like changing up the timing for the 19 and 17 and stuff. It's supposedly to handle weaker ammunition a little bit better and stuff like that. Okay, cool. But realistically speaking, all of these little changes and stuff, what do they really mean? Okay. Now, for me, it's one of these things to where if someone hands me a tricked out Glock and they ask me to shoot it, I'm usually like, okay. I go and I shoot it, and then my brain is always just kind of like, yeah, that's a pistol. Glock to boot. All this really amounts to be perfectly honest, is a Glock slightly better. That's it. There are some little things that you may dislike, but that's, honestly, it's all user preference. There's no perfect pistol, realistically speaking. And if all it really amounts to is a Glock but slightly better, does this mean that you should sell your Gen 4 or your Gen 3 and get one of these? No. My Gen 4 is getting very old as far as round count is concerned, and when I crack a slide on that thing eventually, you guys will find out. But would I have sold it for one of these? No, not really. Would I knock any of the stuff that Glock did to this gun? Also no. It's yet another gun from, quite honestly, a trusted manufacturer that's been running really well, and its customer base isn't the Americas, it's the world. It runs a little more user-friendly. Its trigger is slightly better. It's supposedly more reliable, and we'll see how that goes, but I didn't have any problems at all within the first 3,000 rounds that I fired. And that's it, really. The gun works well, it shoots accurately and reliably, and it's very, very closely resembled to the Glocks that I've used over the past few years now. So, I think it's a good pistol, okay? there's not a whole lot that I can say as far as positive or negative about the changes, because what it amounts to is that it's yet another Glock slightly better. That's all it is to me. So I'd love to hear your guys' opinions. Go ahead and throw them in the comments box and stuff like that below. And also, thanks to Chris with the Spaz 12 project for the shirt. I love it. I shot his Spaz 12, and it's a working pump action and semi-auto Spaz 12. So, you know, them Jurassic Park days in my childhood came back all at once. It was amazing. And that was while it was out at the Team Lockout Jiu-Jitsu range in Indiana, teaching my Pistol 1 and 2 class. Those guys could not have been any cooler. They brought up machine guns for us to shoot and all that, like a full auto SCAR, an AK, and an MP5. It was awesome. So, you know, big shout out to those guys. I hope to teach class out there in Indiana again fairly soon. I'm going to see if I can work that out. And, you know, if you guys want to join the discussion page and talk to these fools on Facebook, I'll leave a link to the Facebook group down below. If you want to support us through Patreon and help push our soldier program where we take soldiers out, fund them, flight, ammo, if we need to, guns, gear, all that stuff. If you want to support that project that we have going while we're teaching every class that we do, you can go ahead and hit the link for that in the description below for the little Patreon page that we'd set up. And if you want to come out and train with us, check out the website. I'll leave a link for that in the description below. I already have the search set up for the mobile classes that we have listed. And if you want to host us, let us know. We'll be glad to come out and teach, particularly if it's out west or anything like that. There's a couple of things that I'm working out there. So, you know, give us a shout. But with all that being said, guys, remember, a regular guy's firearm is the last defense against tyranny, and be easy.